Now then, let me tell you about a night in 14th century Germany, when darkness fell with the sort of deliberate finality that modern folk, with their electric torches and gas lamps, can scarcely imagine. This was an age when night was not merely the absence of day but a presence unto itself, thick, substantial, and requiring its own particular set of skills to navigate successfully. In a certain German county whose name has been lost to the sort of historical indifference that befalls places where nothing dramatically important ever happens, there stood a watchtower that had been performing its duty of watching for exactly no one knew how long, and doing so with the sort of reliable mediocrity that characterizes most human endeavors. The tower rose from the county's highest hill like a stone finger pointing accusingly at the sky, as if to remind the heavens that someone, at least, was paying attention to what went on down below. On this particular evening, as twilight painted the countryside in shades of gray that would have impressed a monk devoted to the aesthetics of contemplation, one Wilhelm the Watchman was preparing for another night of his peculiar profession. Wilhelm, for that was what his mother had called him, though the villagers had long since shortened it to Will, and the tower's ravens had shortened it further to a series of caws that sounded vaguely like his name if one possessed the right sort of imagination, had been the tower's guardian for some 7 years now, ever since the previous watchman had decided that watching for non-existent threats was less appealing than watching for actual fish in the county's well-stocked streams. Now, dear listener, if you find yourself settling comfortably into this tale of medieval vigilance and avian conversation, perhaps you might consider gracing this humble story with your approval, a small gesture of appreciation, or even joining our circle of those who treasure the gentle art of purposefully unstimulating narratives. After all, there are still 3 more parts of this wonderfully uneventful night waiting to unfold, and I do so prefer telling stories to those who understand the particular pleasure of watching paint dry. Metaphorically speaking, the watchtower itself was a masterpiece of practical medieval architecture, which is to say it was designed by someone who understood that the primary virtue of a building should be its ability to remain standing rather than its capacity to inspire aesthetic rapture. Built of local stone that had weathered to the color of old pewter, it rose 4 stories above the landscape, each level serving a specific function in the complex business of professional watching. The ground floor housed the tower's storage areas, barrels of water, sacks of grain, and most importantly, the beer cellar that made Wilhelm's solitary vigil bearable. For it had been discovered, sometime during the reign of a count whose name Wilhelm could never remember, that watchmen who were slightly drunk were more likely to stay awake than watchmen who were completely sober, while being considerably more pleasant to be around than watchmen who were completely drunk. This had led to the establishment of what was known as the watchman's ration, a carefully calculated amount of beer designed to maintain the optimal level of alertness combined with contentment. The second floor contained Wilhelm's living quarters, a collection of rooms that could charitably be described as functional. There was a sleeping chamber barely large enough for a narrow bed and a wooden chest, a sitting room that served as kitchen, dining hall, and workshop depending on the time of day, and a small chamber that Wilhelm had designated as his thinking room, though what he thought about there was a mystery even to himself. The third floor was given over to storage of a more military nature, spare arrows, a crossbow that Wilhelm maintained in perfect working order despite having never found occasion to use it, various pieces of armor that had been accumulating in the tower since its construction, and a collection of polearms whose original purposes had been forgotten but which looked impressively medieval when properly arranged. But it was the 4th floor, the actual watch chamber, that defined the tower's purpose and Wilhelm's existence. This circular room, topped by a conical roof and surrounded by windows that offered views in every direction, was where the real work of watching took place. And it was here, as the last light faded from the western sky, that Wilhelm began each night's shift with the sort of methodical ritual that had developed over years of performing the same essential task. The chamber smelled of old wood, lamp oil, and that indefinable scent that accumulates in places where the same person has spent countless hours pursuing the same activity. Wilhelm's wooden stool sat precisely in the center of the room, positioned to allow equal access to all windows while maintaining comfortable distance from the oil lamp that provided the room's illumination. Around the walls hung various tools of the watchman's trade: a horn for raising alarms that were never needed, a crossbow for repelling attackers who never came, and a wooden staff for defending against threats that remained persistently theoretical. But perhaps the most important fixture in the watch chamber was the logbook, a thick volume bound in leather that had been presented to Wilhelm by the Count's steward with the solemn instruction that he was to record all notable events, suspicious activities, and matters of general interest occurring during the hours of darkness. This had seemed like a reasonable request until Wilhelm discovered that notable events, suspicious activities, and matters of general interest were remarkably scarce in their particular corner of Germany. The result was a logbook filled with entries of stunning mundanity. Cloudy night. No moon visible. Heard owl hooting in east woods. Cat crossed courtyard. Appeared well-fed. Nothing happened. This last entry appeared with such frequency that Wilhelm had eventually abbreviated it to NH, which saved considerable time and ink while accurately summarizing the majority of his professional experiences. As twilight deepened into proper darkness, Wilhelm lit his lamp with the sort of careful attention that came from years of working with open flames in a wooden tower filled with flammable materials. The lamp was a simple but efficient design, a clay vessel filled with oil, with a wick that burned with a steady, gentle flame that provided just enough light to write by without destroying his night vision entirely. With his lamp properly trimmed and his stool positioned at the optimal angle for both comfort and vigilance, Wilhelm opened his logbook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top in his careful, deliberate script. Below this, he added the standard opening notation. Evening watch commenced at twilight. Weather clear, wind from the southwest, temperature cool but not unpleasant. This completed, he settled back to begin the first phase of his nightly routine, the systematic survey of his domain. Starting with the eastern window, he would make a complete circuit of the chamber, spending several minutes at each opening to study the landscape spread out below. Not because he expected to see anything particularly interesting, but because 7 years of watching had taught him that the art of seeing was mostly a matter of looking, and looking required practice. The eastern view encompassed the road that led to the county seat, a winding ribbon of packed earth that disappeared into darkness beyond the range of his vision. During daylight hours, this road occasionally hosted travelers, merchants with their carts, pilgrims with their staffs and determined expressions, and very rarely armed men whose business was their own but whose presence required careful notation in the logbook. At night, however, the road belonged to creatures whose affairs did not concern county politics. Deer, foxes, and the occasional wolf whose howling provided a distant soundtrack to Wilhelm's vigil. From the southern window, he could observe the village that clustered around the tower's base like a child clinging to its mother's skirts. By this hour, most of the houses showed no light save the occasional flicker of a banked fire through shuttered windows. The villagers were practical people who understood that candles cost money and sleep cost nothing, so they retired early and rose with the sun according to rhythms that had governed human life since time immemorial. The western outlook offered the most dramatic view during sunset, when the sky painted itself in colors that had no practical purpose but somehow made Wilhelm feel that his solitary profession had meaning beyond mere employment. By full darkness, however, this window showed only the rolling hills that separated their county from the next, a landscape so peaceful that it seemed to exist primarily to demonstrate that not all of Germany was constantly at war with itself. But it was the northern window that provided the evening's first genuine entertainment, for this was the direction from which Wilhelm's most regular visitor invariably approached. As if summoned by the lighting of the lamp, a large black raven materialized from the darkness and settled on the stone sill with the sort of proprietary confidence that suggested he considered the watchtower as much his domain as Wilhelm's. "Good evening, Corvus," Wilhelm said, for that was what he had named the bird, partly because it seemed appropriate for a raven, and partly because the bird had never offered any alternative suggestions. Corvus fixed Wilhelm with one bright black eye and emitted a series of caws that could have been interpreted as either greeting or complaint, depending on one's perspective. Wilhelm had learned to assume the former, as it made for more pleasant conversation. "Yes, I know you're punctual," Wilhelm continued, reaching into a small bag beside his stool to retrieve a piece of bread saved from his evening meal. 7 years, and you've never missed a night. It's more than can be said for most humans in positions of responsibility." The raven accepted the bread with the sort of dignified gratitude that suggested he considered this offering not charity but a reasonable payment for services rendered. What those services might be was open to interpretation, but Wilhelm had come to value Corvus's presence as proof that his nightly vigil was observed and, presumably, approved by at least one qualified critic. As Corvus settled down to consume his bread with the sort of methodical attention that all intelligent creatures bring to the business of eating, Wilhelm returned to his survey of the night landscape. The lamp flame flickered gently in the slight breeze that managed to find its way through the chamber's windows, casting dancing shadows on the circular walls and creating the sort of intimate atmosphere that made even the most routine tasks feel significant. Outside, the night was settling into its deeper rhythms. An owl called from the direction of the eastern woods, probably the same owl that had been hooting from that location for as long as Wilhelm could remember, though whether owls lived long enough to account for 7 years of consistent territorial behavior was a question that fell outside his area of expertise. From the village below came the occasional sound of a dog barking or a door closing, the small noises that indicated human life continuing its essential business even in the absence of light. Wilhelm opened his logbook and added his first substantial entry of the evening. Corvus arrived at usual time, appeared in good health, accepted customary bread ration without complaint. Owl active in eastern woods. Village quiet. No unusual lights or sounds observed. This might not have qualified as riveting literature, but it fulfilled his contractual obligation to record notable events, and Corvus's punctuality was, in its way, notable. Besides, future generations of watchmen might find value in knowing that ravens were reliable and owls were predictable, information that could prove useful in the complex business of understanding what constituted normal behavior in their particular corner of the world. The lamp settled into its steady burning rhythm, casting a warm pool of light that transformed the watch chamber into a small island of human activity floating in an ocean of medieval darkness. Wilhelm arranged his possessions within easy reach: the logbook, his ink and quill, a small knife for trimming the pen, and a leather flask containing water for those moments when even the watchman's beer ration proved insufficient for maintaining proper hydration. Corvus, having finished his bread, began what appeared to be a comprehensive preening session, attacking his feathers with the sort of systematic thoroughness that suggested he took personal grooming seriously. This was another of the raven's reliable habits. After eating, he always spent precisely the same amount of time arranging his appearance, as if preparing for some important social engagement that would take place later in the evening. Wilhelm found these avian routines oddly comforting. In a profession that consisted largely of waiting for things that never happened, the predictable behavior of a punctual raven provided a sort of structure around which the long hours could be organized. It was, he reflected, rather like having a colleague, albeit one whose conversational contributions were limited to various types of cawing and the occasional rustling of feathers. The night air carried scents that spoke of autumn's approach: wood smoke from banked fires, the earthy smell of fallen leaves beginning their transformation back into soil, and that particular crispness that announced the year's gradual surrender to winter. Wilhelm breathed deeply, appreciating these seasonal signals that marked the passage of time in ways more subtle, but more reliable than any mechanical timepiece. As the full darkness of night settled over the countryside like a familiar blanket, Wilhelm prepared for the long hours ahead. The lamp burned steadily, Corvus maintained his dignified presence on the windowsill, and the logbook waited for whatever events the night might provide, though 7 years of experience suggested that these events would be notable primarily for their absence. But that, Wilhelm had long since realized, was precisely the point. In a world where dramatic events were usually synonymous with disaster, the blessed tedium of an uneventful night was not a failure of professional duty, but its highest achievement. The night had settled into what Wilhelm liked to think of as its working rhythm, that particular quality of darkness that transformed time from a series of discrete moments into a flowing continuum, where minutes became less important than the subtle shifts in shadow and sound that marked the true passage of evening into deep night. His lamp had found its optimal burning level, casting a steady circle of golden light that reached just far enough to illuminate his logbook and writing materials while leaving the rest of the chamber in a comfortable dimness that didn't interfere with his ability to observe the landscape beyond the windows. Corvus had completed his evening grooming ritual and now sat in what Wilhelm had come to recognize as the raven's supervisory posture. Alert but relaxed, one eye occasionally fixed on Wilhelm's activities, while the other monitored the surrounding darkness for whatever mysterious business occupied ravens during the night hours. There was something profoundly reassuring about the bird's presence, a living reminder that Wilhelm's solitary vigil was not quite as solitary as it might appear. The countryside spread out below the tower like a vast tapestry woven from shades of black and gray, punctuated by the occasional pinprick of light from a distant farmhouse where someone was either staying up unusually late or dealing with some minor domestic emergency that required illumination. Wilhelm had learned to distinguish between these different types of nighttime lights. The steady glow of a properly banked fire visible through shutters, the flickering movement of someone carrying a candle from room to room, and the brief flare of a torch being lit for a quick trip to the stable or privy. Each type of light told its own small story about the lives of people who had chosen to remain awake when sensible folk were abed, and Wilhelm found himself constructing elaborate narratives around these distant points of illumination. The farmhouse to the southwest, for instance, showed a light that moved regularly between what appeared to be two different rooms. Probably a new mother attending to an infant, or perhaps someone caring for a sick family member. The consistency of the movement suggested routine rather than crisis, which Wilhelm found oddly comforting. It was while he was engaged in this harmless speculation about distant domestic arrangements that Wilhelm became aware of a new sound in the night's audio landscape, a rhythmic whooshing that grew gradually louder until it resolved itself into the unmistakable wing beats of a large bird approaching the tower. Corvus straightened from his relaxed posture and emitted a single sharp caw that sounded distinctly like a warning, though whether he was warning Wilhelm or the approaching bird remained unclear. The source of the wing beats soon revealed itself as a magnificent eagle owl, considerably larger than the common owls whose hooting provided the night's usual soundtrack. This owl, however, showed no intention of remaining at a polite distance. Instead, it executed a graceful landing on the windowsill directly opposite Corvus, fixing the raven with the sort of intense stare that suggested it had come here with specific business to conduct. Wilhelm had encountered this owl before, though not frequently. Unlike Corvus, who maintained a regular schedule of appearances, this owl, whom Wilhelm had mentally designated as Minerva in honor of the goddess of wisdom, appeared perhaps once or twice a month, always unannounced, always with an air of having important matters to discuss. The problem was that while Corvus seemed content to communicate through a limited vocabulary of cause and the occasional significant look, Minerva was considerably more vocal and appeared to expect responses to her elaborate hooting monologues. "Good evening, Minerva," Wilhelm said politely, though he suspected the owl would have preferred to dispense with human pleasantries and proceed directly to whatever agenda had brought her to the tower. Minerva regarded him with enormous amber eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light, then turned her attention to Corvus and launched into what could only be described as an extended commentary delivered in a series of hoots, clicks, and what Wilhelm could have sworn were disapproving sniffs. Corvus, for his part, listened to this discourse with the sort of patience that suggested he was accustomed to the owl's lengthy presentations, though his occasional responsive caws carried a distinctly defensive tone. Wilhelm found himself in the peculiar position of witnessing what appeared to be a heated debate between two highly opinionated birds, conducted in languages he didn't speak but somehow partially understood through tone and gesture. Minerva's hooting grew more emphatic, accompanied by decisive head movements and occasional wing gestures that seemed designed to emphasize particularly important points. Corvus responded with increasingly elaborate caws, some of which were clearly rebuttals while others sounded like attempts to redirect the conversation toward more agreeable topics. The subject of their disagreement remained mysterious, though Wilhelm suspected it might have something to do with territorial rights, given the way Minerva kept glancing meaningfully around the watch-chamber as if evaluating its suitability for purposes other than human occupation. Ravens and owls, he had observed, seemed to maintain complex relationships that involved both cooperation and competition, depending on circumstances that were probably perfectly clear to the birds themselves but remained opaque to human observers. Perhaps, Wilhelm suggested diplomatically, we could find a way to share the tower that accommodates everyone's needs. After all, there are 4 windows, which should provide adequate perching space for multiple parties. Both birds paused in their debate to fix him with looks that suggested they found his interference well-intentioned but fundamentally irrelevant to the serious business at hand. Minerva then resumed her hooting with renewed vigor, while Corvus shifted position slightly, not enough to suggest retreat, but sufficient to indicate a willingness to negotiate. Wilhelm took advantage of this momentary pause in the avian politics to update his logbook. Large eagle owl arrived approximately 1 hour after full darkness. Engaged in extended discussion with resident raven regarding matters of mutual interest. Both parties appear to be conducting themselves according to established protocols for interspecies diplomacy. This entry might have struck future readers as somewhat whimsical, but Wilhelm had long since decided that accurate observation was more important than maintaining rigid dignity in his record-keeping. Besides, the owl's visits were sufficiently rare to qualify as notable events worthy of documentation, and any future watchman might find it useful to know that the tower occasionally hosted what appeared to be formal conferences between local avian residents. The diplomatic proceedings continued for several more minutes, with both birds making what seemed to be substantive points illustrated by increasingly elaborate gestures. Wilhelm found himself oddly impressed by the sophistication of their communication. Clearly, corvids and raptors had developed far more complex methods of interaction than most humans suspected. Eventually, some sort of accord appeared to be reached. Minerva delivered what sounded like a formal concluding statement. Corvus responded with a series of caws that seemed to indicate agreement or at least acceptance, and both birds settled into positions that suggested the evening's negotiations had been successfully completed. Minerva claimed the western window, positioning herself to observe the hills that rolled away toward the neighboring county, while Corvus maintained his traditional post at the northern opening. With the territorial arrangements settled, the tower returned to its previous state of contemplative quiet. Wilhelm found himself sharing his workspace with two highly competent natural philosophers, each maintaining their own vigil while acknowledging his right to continue his human activities. It was, he reflected, rather like being part of a very small, very specialized professional organization whose membership requirements included the ability to remain awake all night and an appreciation for the subtle dramas that played out under cover of darkness. The lamp continued its steady burning, and Wilhelm returned to his own observations of the night landscape. The various distant lights continued their slow dance of appearing and disappearing as people went about their nocturnal business. A new pinprick of illumination had appeared in the village below, probably the baker beginning his daily routine, since bread needed to be ready by sunrise and the process of mixing, kneading, and baking required several hours of work that necessarily began while most people were still asleep. This thought reminded Wilhelm of his own modest provisions. The watchman's schedule required careful attention to meals, since he needed to remain alert throughout the night but also required sufficient nourishment to maintain his strength. His evening meal had been substantial but not heavy, bread and cheese, with a portion of the preserved meat that formed a staple of the tower's food stores. But the night was long, and strategic snacking was an essential component of successful vigilance. From his carefully organized supplies, Wilhelm retrieved a small wooden bowl and filled it with nuts from his personal store, hazelnuts gathered from the woods below the tower during his off-duty hours. The work of cracking and eating nuts provided a useful activity for his hands while keeping his mind alert and his attention focused on the landscape beyond the windows. It also produced a series of small, rhythmic sounds that seemed to blend harmoniously with the night's natural soundtrack. Corvus turned his head at the sound of the first nut being cracked, his bright eye fixing on Wilhelm's activities with obvious interest. Wilhelm, recognizing the unmistakable signs of avian curiosity about human food, obligingly cracked an extra nut and offered half the meat to his feathered colleague. The raven accepted this contribution with a dignified nod and consumed it with the sort of careful attention that suggested he was evaluating both its nutritional value and its suitability for future reference. Minerva observed this exchange with the sort of lofty detachment that owls seem to cultivate as a matter of professional dignity. When Wilhelm offered her a portion of nut meat, she examined it thoroughly before delicately accepting the offering and consuming it with an air of conferring a great favor upon the provider. Wilhelm had the distinct impression that while Corvus viewed shared food as a pleasant aspect of their professional relationship, Minerva regarded it as tribute appropriately offered to visiting dignitaries. The process of cracking and sharing nuts provided a welcome structure for the next portion of the evening. Wilhelm had learned that the middle hours of the night required particular attention to maintaining alertness, as this was when the natural tendency toward sleep was strongest and the temptation to simply sit quietly and let consciousness drift was most powerful. Small, engaging activities like nut consumption helped maintain the active awareness that effective watching required. As he worked through his modest supply of hazelnuts, Wilhelm found himself appreciating the simple pleasure of having pleasant company during what might otherwise have been a long stretch of solitary vigilance. The presence of Corvus and Minerva transformed the watch chamber from a place of isolated duty into something approaching a social gathering, albeit one conducted largely in silence and governed by protocols that had developed through months and years of repeated interaction. The lamp flame danced gently in the slight breeze that managed to find its way through the chamber's windows, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls and creating the sort of hypnotic visual patterns that could either aid concentration or encourage the dangerous relaxation that led to unwanted sleep. Wilhelm had learned to use these shadow plays as a tool for maintaining alertness, not staring at them directly, which could induce a trance-like state, but allowing them to occupy his peripheral vision while keeping his primary attention focused on the systematic survey of his territory that formed the core of his professional duties. The eastern road remained empty of traffic, which was entirely normal for this hour. The few travelers who insisted on nighttime movement were usually either desperate, criminal, or carrying messages too urgent to wait for daylight, and all three categories preferred to avoid main roads where their activities might be observed by alert watchmen. The southern view of the village showed the expected pattern of darkened houses with the occasional flicker of banked fires, plus the steadily growing glow from the bakery that would soon begin producing the next day's bread supply. From the western hills came the distant howling of wolves, a sound that never failed to send a small shiver of primitive recognition down Wilhelm's spine. The wolves posed no direct threat to the tower or the village. They were too few in number and too well fed on forest game to risk encounters with humans, but their voices carried an echo of older, wilder times when the boundary between civilization and wilderness was considerably less well defined. Wilhelm added another entry to his log. Wolves active in western hills, singing to the moon. Baker has begun morning preparations. Both avian residents have established territorial arrangements and appear to be conducting their respective observations according to professional standards. This last phrase might have amused readers unfamiliar with the serious business of nighttime vigilance, but Wilhelm had come to regard both Corvus and Minerva as genuine colleagues in the work of monitoring their shared domain. Their superior senses often detected changes in the night's patterns before his human awareness registered anything unusual, and their reactions provided valuable early warning of potentially significant developments. The night continued its slow, majestic progression toward dawn, marked by subtle shifts in the quality of darkness and the gradual evolution of the landscape's audio environment. The owls in the eastern woods had settled into their hunting rhythm, their calls becoming more sporadic but more purposeful. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Though without a mechanical timepiece, Wilhelm could only estimate that they had reached the deep middle of the night, that strange temporal territory where yesterday felt distant and tomorrow remained theoretical. It was a time for reflection, for the sort of philosophical contemplation that came naturally during the quiet hours when the world belonged primarily to watchers and dreamers. Wilhelm found himself thinking about the peculiar nature of his profession, a job that consisted largely of ensuring that nothing happened, and that measured success by the absence of events rather than their occurrence. There was something profoundly peaceful about this responsibility, he realized, in a world where most people spent their days actively engaged in making things happen. Planting crops, building houses, conducting business, raising families. His role was to simply observe, to bear witness to the ongoing fact that life continued its essential patterns without requiring constant human intervention. The lamp burned steadily onward, and his two companions maintained their vigilant poses, and the night wrapped around them all like a vast, protective silence that held the promise of dawn still hours away. The deep night had settled into that peculiar temporal zone that exists somewhere between midnight and dawn, when time seems to move according to its own mysterious mathematics, and a single hour can feel like either minutes or an entire lifetime, depending on one's state of mind and the particular quality of one's thoughts. Wilhelm had reached that stage of nighttime vigilance where his consciousness had adapted fully to the rhythm of darkness, his eyes attuned to the subtle gradations of shadow that allowed him to detect movement at considerable distances, his ears calibrated to distinguish between the normal sounds of night and those rare variations that might indicate something worthy of attention. The lamp had settled into its most reliable burning pattern, the flame steady and bright enough to illuminate his immediate workspace, while casting a complex array of shadows that danced and shifted with each small variation in the air currents that moved through the chamber. These shadows had become, over the years, a source of considerable entertainment for Wilhelm, who had discovered that the interplay of flame and darkness could create surprisingly elaborate shadow plays on the circular stone walls. It had begun innocently enough several years ago, when Wilhelm had noticed that his hand, positioned at certain angles between the lamp and the wall, could cast shadows that resembled various animals. A slight adjustment of his fingers transformed a rabbit into a bird, a dog into a dragon, a simple human profile into something that might have been a king or a beggar, depending on one's perspective. What had started as idle amusement during the long, quiet hours had gradually evolved into something approaching an art form, a private theater where Wilhelm served as both puppeteer and audience. Tonight, with Corvus and Minerva maintaining their respective vigils and the countryside offering its usual diet of peaceful nothingness, Wilhelm found himself drawn once again to the possibilities offered by lamplight and creative finger positioning. The shadows cast by his hands seemed particularly cooperative this evening, perhaps influenced by the lamp's optimal burning or the specific quality of darkness that surrounded the tower. The stone walls, worn smooth by centuries of weather and time, provided an excellent surface for shadow projection, their pale gray color serving as a neutral canvas that allowed even the most delicate shadow work to be clearly visible. He began with simple forms, the classic rabbit that every child learned to make with thumb and forefingers, the bird that required only a slight repositioning of the same basic hand configuration. But as his fingers warmed to the work and his imagination engaged with the possibilities, the shadows became more elaborate. A horse galloped across the stone wall, followed by a rider whose cape billowed dramatically in the windless shadow world. The rider carried a banner that fluttered and danced as Wilhelm adjusted the position of his pinky finger, and when the horseman reached the far side of the wall, he wheeled his mount around and charged back in the opposite direction, engaged in some urgent mission that existed only in the interplay of light and darkness. Corvus noticed these activities with the sort of intelligent curiosity that suggested he understood that something deliberately artistic was taking place. The raven turned from his window to observe Wilhelm's shadow casting with obvious interest, his head tilting at various angles as if trying to comprehend the relationship between the human's hand movements and the resulting images on the wall. Occasionally, Corvus would emit a soft caw that seemed to indicate either approval or constructive criticism. Wilhelm chose to interpret these sounds as encouragement, though he suspected the raven's aesthetic standards might be quite different from his own. Minerva, maintaining her position at the western window, observed the shadow play with the sort of dignified attention that owls brought to all phenomena that fell outside their immediate understanding. Her large amber eyes tracked the moving shadows with the intense focus of a creature whose survival depended on accurately interpreting visual information, though Wilhelm suspected she found the entire enterprise puzzling rather than entertaining. There was something almost scholarly about her attention, as if she were studying the shadow play as a form of human behavior worthy of academic investigation. The shadows grew more ambitious as Wilhelm's hands found their rhythm, and his imagination expanded to fill the creative space offered by the flickering lamplight. A procession of knights appeared on the wall, their banner-bearers preceding them in a parade that existed only in the interplay of light and darkness. Each knight was distinct. One carried a sword, another bore a shield decorated with heraldic devices that Wilhelm created through careful finger positioning. A third rode a horse whose prancing gait required complex manipulation of both hands working in coordination. Behind the knights came a dragon, its serpentine neck created by the sinuous movement of Wilhelm's forearm, while his fingers formed the creature's head and jaws. The dragon breathed shadow fire at shadow heroes who fought with shadow swords in battles that raged silently across the circular chamber, their weapons clashing in combat that produced no sound but somehow conveyed all the drama of epic conflict through the eloquent language of moving shadows. Wilhelm found himself constructing elaborate narratives around these ephemeral images. The dragon was defending its treasure from knights whose motives were questionable at best. Perhaps they sought the gold for noble purposes, or perhaps they were simply adventurers attracted by the prospect of wealth and glory. The battle raged back and forth across the stone walls, with the dragon's superior size and firepower balanced against the knight's superior numbers and tactical coordination. A ship sailed through shadow seas, its sails filled with shadow wind, carrying shadow passengers to shadow destinations that existed nowhere but in the dancing patterns cast by carefully positioned fingers. Wilhelm created waves for the ship to navigate, storms for it to weather, and distant coastlines for it to approach. The passengers were pilgrims, perhaps, seeking a holy shrine that might or might not exist, or they might have been merchants carrying goods to markets in foreign lands, or explorers venturing into unknown waters in search of whatever mysteries lay beyond the horizon. The castle that appeared and disappeared with each shift of his hands housed a king who ruled over subjects made entirely of light and darkness, governing a kingdom that lasted only as long as the lamp continued to burn. This shadow king held court with shadow nobles, received petitions from shadow peasants, and made decisions that affected the lives of people who existed only in the interplay of flame and stone. Wilhelm found himself wondering about the nature of such rule. What responsibilities did a shadow king bear toward shadow subjects? And how did one govern a realm that existed only in the imagination of a lonely watchman? It was while he was engaged in creating a particularly complex shadow story involving a tournament between various shadow knights, each competing for the favor of a shadow princess whose beauty was legendary throughout the Shadow Kingdom, that Wilhelm became aware of a new element in the knight's soundtrack. From somewhere below the tower came a sound that was distinctly artificial, not the natural music of wind and water and forest creatures, but something that spoke of human activity during hours when most humans were sensibly asleep. The sound was rhythmic, metallic, and somehow purposeful, not the random clanking that might result from wind moving loose objects, but the deliberate noise of someone working with metal tools in the darkness below the tower. Each strike was measured and precise, suggesting the work of someone who knew exactly what they were trying to accomplish and possessed the skill to accomplish it efficiently. Wilhelm paused in his shadow play, his hands frozen in mid-gesture as he listened more carefully to identify the source of this unusual sound. The metallic ringing came at regular intervals, interspersed with softer sounds that might have been the scraping of files or the gentle tapping of smaller implements. It was the distinctive audio signature of metalworking, the ancient craft of shaping iron and steel through the application of heat, force, and patient expertise. Both Corvus and Minerva had noticed the sound as well, their alert postures indicating that this was indeed something outside the normal range of nighttime activities. Corvus moved to a different position on his windowsill, craning his neck to peer down toward the base of the tower, his bright black eyes scanning the darkness below for any sign of the source of the disturbance. Minerva swiveled her head in the fluid, impossible way that owls managed, rotating nearly completely around to focus her attention on the direction from which the metallic sounds were emanating. Wilhelm extinguished his hand shadows and moved to the southern window, the one that provided the best view of the tower's immediate surroundings. Peering carefully into the darkness below, he could make out a faint glow that seemed to be emanating from the ground level of the tower, specifically from the vicinity of the beer cellar where the tower's liquid provisions were stored. The light was too steady and controlled to be accidental, too purposeful to be the result of natural phenomena. The realization that someone was conducting unauthorized activities in his beer cellar filled Wilhelm with a complex mixture of professional concern and personal indignation. As the tower's guardian, he was responsible for protecting all of its contents from theft or damage. This was a fundamental aspect of his duty that had been emphasized repeatedly during his initial training. As a man who had carefully calculated his nightly beer rations to last through the winter months, accounting for seasonal variations in delivery schedules and the occasional need for emergency hospitality, he was particularly sensitive to any unauthorized access to the alcoholic reserves. The beer cellar contained not only the tower's supply of ale and wine, but also various preserved foods, tools, and other materials essential for maintaining the watchtower's operational capability during periods when resupply might be difficult or impossible. The security of these provisions was not merely a matter of personal convenience but a genuine military concern, since a besieged or isolated tower needed to be able to sustain its garrison for extended periods. Moving quietly, partly from professional caution and partly from an instinctive sense that stealth might be advantageous in whatever situation was developing below, Wilhelm made his way to the trapdoor that provided access to the lower levels of the tower. The wooden ladder that connected the watch chamber to the third floor had been worn smooth by years of regular use, and Wilhelm's feet found the familiar handholds automatically, even in the dim light that filtered up from below. The third floor, with its collection of military equipment and forgotten armor, seemed particularly shadowy and mysterious in the darkness. The various polearms and shields that lined the walls cast strange shapes in the faint illumination, creating a forest of warrior shadows that might have been intimidating to someone less familiar with their harmless reality. Wilhelm paused here long enough to select a crossbow, not because he expected to need it, but because investigating unusual nighttime activities was theoretically part of his professional duties, and professional duties were best approached with appropriate equipment. The crossbow was a well-maintained piece, its string properly tensioned and its mechanism recently oiled according to the maintenance schedule that Wilhelm followed religiously. He selected a bolt from the rack of ammunition and loaded the weapon with the sort of automatic precision that came from years of military training, though he hoped sincerely that he would not have occasion to use it. Violence was always a last resort in situations involving potential theft or trespass, but the option needed to be available should diplomacy prove insufficient. The second floor, containing his living quarters, felt oddly foreign in the darkness. The familiar furniture and personal possessions that made up his domestic world seemed transformed by night and unusual circumstances into objects that belonged to someone else's life. His bed, neatly made according to the military precision that 7 years of solitary living had ingrained in him, looked like it had been waiting for a different person to return to it. The wooden chest that contained his personal belongings sat closed and silent, keeping its own counsel about the contents within. The sitting room, which served multiple functions as kitchen, dining hall, and workshop, showed signs of Wilhelm's evening meal and his preparations for the night's watch. A wooden bowl that had contained his supper of bread and cheese sat on the simple table, along with the knife he used for cutting food and the cup from which he had drunk his carefully rationed portion of ale. These domestic details seemed strangely significant in the context of potential emergency, reminders of the peaceful routine that might be about to be disrupted by whatever was occurring in the cellar below. But it was when Wilhelm reached the ground floor that the true nature of the nighttime intrusion became clear. The metallic sounds were indeed coming from the beer cellar, accompanied now by what sounded distinctly like muffled conversation conducted in voices that were trying very hard to remain quiet. The speakers were clearly attempting to avoid detection, but the acoustic properties of the stone cellar carried their words upward through the tower's structure, making their presence unmistakable to anyone listening carefully. A faint light leaked from beneath the heavy wooden door that secured the tower's liquid provisions, creating a thin line of illumination that spoke of deliberate human activity rather than accidental fire or natural phenomenon. The unmistakable aroma of spilled beer suggested that whoever was conducting business in his cellar was not being particularly careful with the merchandise, or possibly was sampling the inventory in the process of whatever other activities they were pursuing. Wilhelm paused at the cellar door, crossbow in hand, trying to decide on the appropriate protocol for confronting unauthorized beer cellar activities. His instructions from the Count Steward had covered many aspects of tower defense: procedures for dealing with armed attacks, protocols for communicating with friendly forces, methods for rationing supplies during sieges, but had been notably silent on the specific procedures for dealing with nighttime theft of alcoholic provisions by persons unknown. The situation clearly called for a balance between assertive professional action and the sort of diplomatic approach that might resolve the matter without unnecessary violence. Wilhelm had no desire to harm anyone over a barrel of beer, but he also could not simply ignore unauthorized access to the tower's secured areas. His reputation as a reliable guardian depended on maintaining proper security while exercising reasonable judgment about the appropriate level of response to different types of threats. "I am aware that you are in my beer cellar," Wilhelm announced through the door, using the sort of firm but reasonable tone that he hoped would convey authority without sounding unnecessarily threatening. "I am also aware that you appear to be consuming beer that belongs to the tower's official supplies. I would appreciate an explanation of your activities and your intentions regarding compensation for any beverages that may have been consumed." The sounds from within the cellar ceased immediately, followed by a period of silence that suggested the intruders were engaged in rapid consultation about their options. Wilhelm waited patiently, crossbow ready but not obviously threatening, prepared to deal with whatever emerged from his beer cellar. The silence stretched long enough to suggest that the occupants were conducting a thorough discussion of their situation and possible responses. When conversation finally resumed within the cellar, it was conducted in whispers too quiet for Wilhelm to distinguish individual words, though the tone suggested urgent debate rather than hostile planning. This gave him some hope that the situation might be resolved through negotiation rather than force, since people planning violence typically did not engage in lengthy strategic discussions about their options. What eventually emerged from the cellar, after several more minutes of muffled conversation, was a voice that Wilhelm recognized as belonging to Klaus the tinker, an itinerant metalworker who traveled between the various villages in the county, repairing pots and tools and generally making himself useful to people whose possessions had suffered the normal wear and tear of daily use. Wilhelm had encountered Klaus several times over the years, always in daylight and always under circumstances related to legitimate business, which made his presence in the beer cellar at this hour both surprising and reassuring. "Master Wilhelm," Klaus called through the door, his voice carrying the sort of careful politeness that suggested he understood he had been caught in a potentially compromising position but hoped to resolve the matter through reasonable discussion. "It is Klaus, and I am here with my apprentice Johann. We have taken shelter in your cellar due to circumstances beyond our control, and we have indeed consumed a small portion of your beer, for which we are prepared to offer appropriate compensation." This explanation raised almost as many questions as it answered, but it did suggest that the nighttime intrusion was more a matter of unauthorized shelter-seeking than actual theft with criminal intent. Wilhelm considered his options, weighing his professional obligations against the practical realities of dealing with travelers who claimed to have found themselves in difficult circumstances that required emergency accommodation. Klaus was known in the county as an honest craftsman whose work was reliable and whose prices were fair. His reputation for integrity was well established among the villages he served, and Wilhelm had never heard any complaints about his conduct or reliability. If Klaus claimed to have legitimate reasons for seeking shelter in the tower cellar, those reasons were probably genuine rather than fabricated to cover criminal activity. "Klaus," Wilhelm replied, "I am going to open this door, and you and your apprentice are going to explain your circumstances and your presence in my cellar. I am armed, but I am not unreasonable. However, I do expect a complete accounting of any beer that has been consumed, and I reserve the right to determine whether your circumstances justify your unauthorized use of tower facilities." The door opened to reveal Klaus and a young man who was presumably Johann, both looking considerably more sheepish than dangerous. Klaus was a man of middle years whose clothing and hands bore the permanent stains that marked him as someone who worked regularly with hot metal and various chemical compounds used in the tinker's trade. His leather apron showed signs of recent use, with fresh burn marks and metal filings that suggested he had been pursuing his craft recently. Johann appeared to be in his early 20s, with the sort of earnest expression that suggested he was still learning the finer points of his craft and was probably not the mastermind behind whatever had brought them to Wilhelm's cellar. Between them sat an opened barrel of beer and 2 wooden cups that showed clear evidence of recent use. The metallic sounds that had attracted Wilhelm's attention were apparently the result of Klaus working on some piece of equipment by the light of a small oil lamp, using the cellar as an improvised workshop while taking advantage of the beer's availability for refreshment during his labors. Scattered around their improvised workspace were the tools of the tinker's trade: hammers of various sizes, files, punches, and several pieces of metalwork in different stages of repair. A damaged stirrup showed signs of careful attention, with new rivets being fitted to replace ones that had failed. A cooking pot displayed evidence of expert patching where a crack had been sealed with a precisely fitted metal patch. Several knife blades lay waiting for handles to be fitted or edges to be properly tempered. "Master Wilhelm," Klaus began, his voice carrying genuine respect mixed with the sort of embarrassment that comes from being discovered in circumstances that require explanation. "We were traveling to the village of Steinbach when our cart threw a wheel just as darkness was falling. The wheel is damaged beyond immediate repair, and we judged it unwise to continue our journey on foot during the night hours. Your tower offered the only available shelter, and we took the liberty of entering the cellar to escape the cold and damp. The beer consumption was, well, it seemed appropriate given the circumstances, and we fully intended to inform you of our presence and arrange proper compensation at first light." Wilhelm examined the evidence of their nighttime activities with the sort of careful attention that his years of professional vigilance had taught him to apply to unusual situations. The beer barrel showed signs of having been opened properly rather than broken into, suggesting that Klaus possessed the appropriate tools and knowledge for accessing such containers without causing damage to the tower's property. The amount of beer consumed appeared to be modest, perhaps 2 or 3 cups total, which fell well within the range of what might be considered reasonable compensation for the provision of emergency shelter to travelers in distress. The tinker's tools were exactly what one would expect from a legitimate craftsman pursuing his trade, with no evidence of equipment that might be used for breaking and entering or other criminal activities. The work being conducted on various metal objects was clearly professional in nature, the sort of careful repair work that required skill, patience, and proper illumination to execute correctly. "And the metallic sounds?" Wilhelm asked, noting the various pieces of metalwork that were arranged on a cloth beside the beer barrel, each showing signs of recent attention from skilled hands. "I was attempting to repair a damaged stirrup for a customer in Steinbach," Klaus explained, holding up a piece of ironwork that showed clear signs of recent attention and expert craftsmanship. "The work requires good light and steady hands, both of which are difficult to achieve in the open air during darkness. Your cellar provided excellent working conditions, and I thought to make productive use of the time while we waited for dawn, rather than simply sitting idle and consuming your hospitality without offering anything useful in return." This explanation had the virtue of making perfect sense while also suggesting that Klaus was the sort of craftsman who took his professional obligations seriously enough to continue working even under difficult circumstances. Wilhelm found himself oddly impressed by this dedication to duty, recognizing something of his own commitment to maintaining professional standards regardless of external conditions. The notion of using emergency shelter time productively rather than simply waiting passively for conditions to improve demonstrated the sort of practical wisdom that Wilhelm associated with reliable, competent people. A tinker who continued repairing equipment even while stranded by equipment failure was probably exactly the sort of person who could be trusted to use tower facilities responsibly and provide fair compensation for any resources consumed. The crossbow, which had seemed like a reasonable precaution when investigating unknown intruders, now felt unnecessarily dramatic. Wilhelm lowered it and considered the situation from a more practical perspective. Two traveling craftsmen, caught by equipment failure during darkness, seeking shelter and making modest use of available resources while continuing to pursue their legitimate business. It was hardly the sort of criminal activity that required stern measures or official intervention. "Very well," Wilhelm said, settling his crossbow aside and adopting a more conversational tone. "You may remain in the cellar until dawn, at which point I assume you will continue your journey to Steinbach. The beer you have consumed can be considered payment for the shelter provided, assuming you limit your consumption to reasonable amounts and avoid making excessive noise that might interfere with my professional duties. However, I require that you maintain quiet working practices, as I have responsibilities that require my attention throughout the night hours." Klaus and Johann exchanged glances that suggested relief mixed with gratitude for Wilhelm's reasonable approach to their predicament. "Master Wilhelm," Klaus said, "you are most generous, and we appreciate your understanding of our circumstances. We will disturb you no further, and we will ensure that your cellar is left in proper condition when we depart. If there is any work that we might perform for you in exchange for your hospitality, we would be honored to provide such services." This offer of reciprocal assistance was exactly the sort of gesture that Wilhelm had come to expect from honest craftsmen who understood the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the communities they served. It also suggested that Klaus was genuinely grateful for the shelter rather than simply taking advantage of an opportunity for unauthorized access to tower resources. With this understanding established, Wilhelm returned to his watch chamber, leaving Klaus and Johann to their tinker's work in the beer cellar. The brief excitement of investigating potential intrusion had provided a welcome break in the night's routine, but it had also reminded him that even the most peaceful vigils could produce unexpected responsibilities that required careful judgment and diplomatic handling. The knowledge that the tower was now hosting legitimate guests rather than mysterious intruders changed the entire atmosphere of the night's watch. Instead of being the sole human occupant of the tower, Wilhelm was now part of a small community of craftsmen, each pursuing their respective duties according to their own professional standards. The faint sounds of Klaus's continued metalwork provided a companionable background to the night's activities, a reminder that useful work could be accomplished even under unusual circumstances. Back in the watch chamber, Corvus and Minerva were maintaining their positions with the sort of patient alertness that suggested they had been monitoring the situation and had concluded that no serious threat was involved. Both birds seemed to have accepted the presence of additional humans in the tower as falling within acceptable parameters for nighttime activities, though Wilhelm suspected they would continue to observe developments with their characteristic careful attention. Wilhelm resumed his seat, relit his lamp to optimal brightness, and updated his logbook with the evening's most significant entry to date. Traveling tinkers Klaus and Johann took shelter in Tower Cellar due to equipment failure during journey to Steinbach. Granted permission to remain until dawn in exchange for modest beer consumption and commitment to maintain appropriate noise levels. No security concerns identified. Both parties conducted themselves according to appropriate standards of mutual courtesy and professional respect. This entry would provide useful information for future watchmen who might encounter similar situations, while also establishing a precedent for the sort of humanitarian exceptions that could be made to the tower's security protocols without compromising its essential functions. The balance between security requirements and reasonable accommodation of travelers in distress was exactly the sort of judgment call that separated competent guardians from inflexible rule followers. With the immediate excitement resolved and the tower's guest situation properly documented, Wilhelm returned to his shadow play activities, though now with the additional awareness that his audience included not only Corvus and Minerva but also the faint sounds of Klaus working steadily in the cellar below. The knowledge that the tower was hosting other people engaged in their own nocturnal activities added a new dimension to the night's atmosphere. A sense of shared purpose among craftsmen who understood the value of using available time productively, regardless of circumstances. The shadows danced once again across the stone walls, carrying their silent stories of knights and dragons, ships and castles, while below, the steady tapping of Klaus's hammer provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the night's natural soundtrack. Wilhelm found that the metalworking sounds actually enhanced his shadow play activities, providing a sort of percussion section for his visual theater that made the whole performance feel more complete and professional. He created a new shadow story inspired by the presence of Klaus and Johann in the cellar below, a tale of traveling craftsmen who found shelter in a magical tower where friendly spirits watched over their work and ensured that honest labor was always rewarded. The shadow craftsmen worked at their shadow-anvil while shadow guardians maintained their eternal vigil, and shadow birds provided wisdom and commentary on the proceedings. The lamp burned steadily onward, casting its circle of working light while the deep night continued its ancient progression toward the distant promise of dawn. Wilhelm felt a deep satisfaction in the knowledge that his tower was serving its proper function not only as a military observation post but as a beacon of hospitality for travelers in need, a place where honest work was respected and reasonable requests for assistance were granted according to the ancient traditions of mutual aid among craftsmen. The night seemed fuller now, richer with the knowledge that multiple human stories were unfolding simultaneously within the tower's protective walls, each contributing to the complex tapestry of experience that made even the most routine vigil into something approaching adventure. The night had reached that mysterious hour when darkness begins its slow, almost imperceptible surrender to the approaching dawn, not yet showing any visible signs of retreat, but somehow losing the absolute authority it had wielded during the deep midnight hours. Wilhelm, seasoned by 7 years of nocturnal vigils, could sense this subtle shift in the night's character through changes too delicate for casual observation. The gradual modification of bird calls in the eastern woods, the barely detectable alteration in the quality of air movement through the tower's windows, and that indefinable sense that time itself was beginning to lean toward morning rather than away from it. This was the hour that Wilhelm privately thought of as the deep watch, that portion of the night when the boundary between waking and sleeping became most porous, when thoughts took on the fluid quality of dreams, while consciousness remained alert and focused. It was during these hours that he often experienced his most profound insights about the nature of his profession, understanding with sudden clarity why societies had always maintained watchers during the dark hours, and why the job attracted men who found meaning in solitude and purpose in vigilance. The steady rhythm of Klaus's hammer had continued throughout the night, providing a comforting counterpoint to the natural sounds of darkness. The tinker was clearly a craftsman who understood the value of persistent, careful work, each strike of his hammer deliberate and purposeful, gradually coaxing damaged metal back into useful form through the ancient alchemy of skill, patience, and properly applied force. Wilhelm found this dedication oddly inspiring, a reminder that meaningful work could be accomplished under the most unpromising circumstances, provided one possessed the proper combination of tools, knowledge, and determination. The metalworking sounds had developed their own rhythm over the hours, a steady percussion that blended harmoniously with the night's natural orchestra. Sometimes Klaus would pause in his hammering to file or scrape at his work, producing softer sounds that spoke of detail work and fine adjustments. Occasionally, Johann's voice could be heard asking quiet questions about technique or requesting clarification about some aspect of the repair process, suggesting that the apprentice was using this unusual opportunity to advance his education in the metalworking arts. Corvus and Minerva had settled into what appeared to be a comfortable state of mutual tolerance, each maintaining their respective watch positions while occasionally exchanging the sort of brief, professional communications that suggested they had established a temporary working relationship for the duration of the night. Wilhelm had come to think of them as his night shift colleagues, each contributing their own specialized expertise to the collective enterprise of monitoring their shared territory. The Raven's keen eyesight and intelligence made him particularly valuable for detecting unusual movement or changes in the familiar patterns of nocturnal activity. Corvus seemed to possess an encyclopedic knowledge of the local wildlife and their habits, demonstrating an ability to distinguish between normal animal behavior and activities that might warrant closer investigation. His occasional soft caws served as a sort of running commentary on the night's developments, alerting Wilhelm to phenomena that might otherwise escape human notice. Minerva, with her superior hearing and natural affinity for darkness, provided a different but equally valuable perspective on the night's activities. Owls possessed auditory capabilities that far exceeded human limitations, able to detect and locate small sounds across considerable distances with remarkable precision. Her presence at the western window allowed her to monitor the hills and forests in that direction, areas that were largely beyond Wilhelm's ability to observe effectively during the dark hours. The shadow play had evolved throughout the night into something approaching a complex narrative art form, with Wilhelm developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for creating multi-layered stories that unfolded across the chamber's circular walls. What had begun as simple animal shapes had progressed through medieval adventures and maritime voyages to elaborate tales that seemed to incorporate elements drawn from his subconscious mind. Stories that surprised even their creator with their unexpected developments and symbolic resonances. Tonight's Shadow Theater had taken on a distinctly collaborative quality, influenced by the presence of Klaus and Johann working in the cellar below. Wilhelm found himself creating stories about craftsmen and their guilds, about the relationships between masters and apprentices, about the satisfaction that came from transforming raw materials into useful objects through the application of skill and patience. The shadows seemed to dance with particular enthusiasm when portraying scenes of productive labor, as if the lamp flame itself approved of stories that celebrated honest work and professional dedication. One particularly elaborate shadow story had emerged featuring a master craftsman who discovered that his workshop had been blessed by benevolent spirits who assisted with difficult projects during the dark hours. The shadow craftsman would begin working on some challenging task, only to find that mysterious helpers had advanced the work while he slept, leaving behind evidence of their nocturnal assistance in the form of perfectly executed details that exceeded his own capabilities. Wilhelm had developed this narrative over several nights, adding new episodes and complications each time he returned to it. Tonight, influenced by the actual presence of Klaus and Johann in the tower, the story took on new dimensions. The shadow craftsman discovered that his mysterious helpers were not spirits at all, but fellow artisans who had taken shelter in his workshop and were contributing their own skills to the collective enterprise of creation. The revelation led to a partnership that benefited all parties, demonstrating the value of cooperation and mutual assistance among practitioners of the crafts. As Wilhelm manipulated his hands to create this latest installment of the Shadow Craftsman saga, he became aware that Corvus was paying particularly close attention to the performance. The Raven had shifted position slightly to get a better view of the wall where the shadows were dancing, and his bright black eyes tracked every movement with obvious interest. Occasionally, Corvus would emit soft sounds that seemed timed to coincide with dramatic moments in the story, as if he were providing a soundtrack or commentary for the visual narrative. Minerva, while maintaining her primary focus on the western landscape, would occasionally turn her great head to observe the shadow play with the sort of scholarly attention that suggested she was studying the phenomenon as much for its technical aspects as for its entertainment value. Wilhelm had the distinct impression that both birds understood, on some level, that they were witnessing a form of human artistic expression, and that they found the experience worthy of their intellectual consideration. The lamp flame flickered slightly as a gentle breeze moved through the chamber, causing the shadows to waver and shift in ways that added an element of spontaneous variation to Wilhelm's carefully choreographed narratives. These unexpected movements often suggested new directions for the stories to take, as if the flame itself were contributing creative input to the collaborative process of shadow theater creation. Wilhelm had learned to incorporate these random elements into his performances, treating them as opportunities for improvisation rather than disruptions to be resisted. The shadow stories became more organic and unpredictable as a result, developing in directions that neither Wilhelm nor his audience could anticipate. Sometimes a chance flicker would transform a peaceful scene into something more dramatic, or would suggest the appearance of new characters who had not been part of the original narrative plan. The countryside beyond the tower windows continued its own quiet activities, largely invisible to human observation but detected and interpreted by Wilhelm's avian colleagues. Corvus would occasionally issue brief alerts when his sharp eyes detected movement in the darkness, usually deer making their way to water sources, or foxes conducting their nocturnal hunting activities. Minerva would respond to sounds that Wilhelm couldn't hear, her head swiveling to track the progress of small creatures moving through the grass and undergrowth far below. These natural dramas unfolding in the landscape provided inspiration for new shadow stories, as Wilhelm found himself creating narratives about the hidden lives of forest creatures, the complex relationships between predators and prey, and the ancient cycles of activity that governed the natural world during the dark hours. The shadows on the wall became foxes stalking through moonlit meadows, deer gathering at woodland streams, and owls conducting their silent hunts with deadly precision. The village below the tower showed signs of the earliest stirrings of dawn preparation, though true sunrise was still hours away. A faint glow appeared in one of the houses, probably the miller beginning his daily routine, since flour grinding was a task that often began before dawn to take advantage of the cooler morning hours. The bakery's light had grown steadier and brighter, suggesting that the bread-making process was well underway and that fresh loaves would be available by the time the village properly awakened. Wilhelm found these early signs of returning human activity oddly comforting, evidence that the night's vigil was serving its proper purpose of bridging the gap between yesterday's sunset and tomorrow's dawn. His role as watchman was not merely to observe and record, but to maintain continuity between the day world of conscious activity and the night world of sleep and dreams, ensuring that the transition between these different modes of existence occurred smoothly and safely. The steady rhythm of Klaus's work continued from the cellar below, now accompanied by the softer sounds of finishing work, the careful filing and polishing that transformed rough repairs into properly completed craftsmanship. Johann's voice could be heard occasionally, asking questions about technique or requesting guidance on some aspect of the work, suggesting that the apprentice was taking full advantage of this unusual opportunity for extended instruction. Wilhelm decided that the time had come for another entry in his logbook, this one documenting the night's progression toward dawn and the various activities that had marked the deep watch hours. He opened the leather-bound volume to a fresh page and began to write in his careful, precise script. Deep watch hours progressed without incident. Guests in cellar continue productive work, maintaining appropriate noise levels. Both avian residents alert and actively monitoring respective territories. Weather remains clear, wind light from southwest. Eastern villages showing early signs of dawn preparation. All observations consistent with normal patterns for this time of year and season. He paused in his writing, considering whether to include any mention of his shadow play activities. After a moment's reflection, he decided that future watchmen might find such information useful, as entertainment during long vigils was a legitimate professional concern. He added, "Shadow theater exercises continued throughout Deep Watch, providing effective means of maintaining alertness while exercising creative faculties. Recommend this technique for extended solitary vigils." This addition to the official record might have seemed whimsical to some readers, but Wilhelm had long since decided that accurate documentation of effective watchman techniques was more important than maintaining rigid formality in his entries. Any innovation that helped a guardian maintain proper alertness and mental acuity during the challenging deep night hours deserved to be preserved for the benefit of future tower keepers. As Wilhelm completed his log entry and set down his quill, Corvus suddenly straightened from his relaxed posture and emitted a sharp caw that clearly indicated he had detected something worthy of attention. Both Wilhelm and Minerva immediately focused their attention on the raven, recognizing this as one of his standard alert signals rather than casual commentary. Corvus was staring intently toward the eastern road, his body language suggesting that he had observed movement or activity in that direction. Wilhelm moved quickly to the eastern window and peered into the darkness, his eyes scanning the landscape for whatever had attracted the raven's attention. At first, he could see nothing unusual. The road appeared empty, and the surrounding countryside showed no signs of activity beyond the normal movements of nocturnal wildlife. But as Wilhelm continued to observe, his human vision gradually detected what Corvus's superior eyesight had noticed immediately. A faint glow moving slowly along the eastern road, still at considerable distance but approaching steadily toward the tower. The light was too large and too steady to be a simple torch, suggesting either a group of travelers with multiple light sources or perhaps a cart with lanterns mounted for nighttime travel. Nighttime travel was unusual enough to warrant careful observation, since most people preferred to avoid the risks and difficulties associated with moving through unfamiliar territory in darkness. Those who chose to travel at night usually had compelling reasons for doing so: urgent business that couldn't wait for daylight, or a desire to avoid attention that might come from daylight passage through populated areas. Wilhelm retrieved his spyglass from its place among his professional equipment and focused it on the approaching light. The magnification revealed what appeared to be a small group of mounted travelers, perhaps 3 or 4 individuals, carrying lanterns to illuminate their path. Their pace was steady but unhurried, suggesting that they were not fleeing from pursuit, but were simply choosing to travel during the cooler night hours for reasons of comfort or convenience. As the travelers drew closer, Wilhelm was able to make out more details of their party. They appeared to be well-equipped and organized, with proper traveling gear and what looked like a pack animal carrying supplies. Their clothing and equipment suggested merchants or possibly minor nobles traveling on legitimate business, rather than the sort of desperate or criminal travelers who sometimes use darkness to conceal questionable activities. Wilhelm updated his logbook with this new development. Approaching travelers observed on Eastern Road, estimated arrival at tower vicinity within 1 hour. Party appears to consist of 3 to 4 mounted individuals with pack animal, well-equipped for legitimate travel. No obvious signs of hostile intent or unusual urgency detected. This entry would provide useful information should the travelers prove to be significant in any way, while also documenting Wilhelm's observational procedures for future reference. The approach of legitimate travelers during the night hours was not necessarily cause for alarm, but it did require careful monitoring to ensure that they posed no threat to the tower or the surrounding community. Corvus continued to track the travelers' progress with his characteristic attention to detail, while Minerva had shifted position to observe the approaching group from her own perspective. Both birds seemed to consider the newcomers worthy of professional interest but not alarming enough to warrant more aggressive defensive postures. From the cellar below, the sounds of Klaus's work continued unabated, suggesting that the tinker was either unaware of the approaching travelers or was confident that their arrival posed no threat to his own activities. The steady rhythm of hammer and file indicated that he was making good progress on his repair work and would probably have several items ready for delivery when morning allowed him to resume his journey to Steinbach. The approaching travelers provided a new element of interest for Wilhelm's shadow play activities, as he found himself creating stories about mysterious nighttime journeys and the various reasons that might compel people to travel during the dark hours. The shadows on the wall became a caravan of shadow merchants carrying precious goods to distant markets, their shadow lanterns casting pools of moving light that danced across the stone surface in patterns that echoed the real lanterns moving along the actual road. As the travelers drew nearer, Wilhelm was able to observe more details of their equipment and behavior. They appeared to be maintaining proper road discipline, with one member of the party riding slightly ahead as a scout while the others maintained a protective formation around their pack animal. This suggested military or professional training, indicating that they were probably not casual travelers but people accustomed to the challenges and potential dangers of long-distance travel. The lead rider carried what appeared to be a staff or banner, though the darkness made it impossible to determine whether this bore any heraldic devices that might identify their affiliation or destination. Their pace remained steady and purposeful, neither hurried enough to suggest flight nor cautious enough to indicate that they were attempting to avoid detection. Wilhelm found himself wondering about their destination and purpose. Travelers heading toward the county seat might have business with the court or administrative offices that required early arrival. Merchants might be attempting to reach market towns in time for specific trading opportunities. Messengers could be carrying communications that required timely delivery to recipients in the eastern villages. Whatever their business, the travelers appeared to be conducting themselves according to proper protocols for nighttime passage through settled territory. They were maintaining reasonable noise levels, following the established road rather than cutting across private property, and showing their lights clearly rather than attempting to move stealthily. These were the behaviors of people who had nothing to hide and were simply going about legitimate business under unusual but not suspicious circumstances. As the travelers reached the closest point of approach to the tower, Wilhelm was able to make out additional details through his spyglass. The lead rider appeared to be an older man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, while his companions seemed younger and more deferential. Their equipment was well maintained and of good quality, suggesting prosperity and attention to proper preparation for extended travel. The group paused briefly at the intersection near the tower, apparently consulting among themselves about their route or possibly taking a moment to rest their animals. Wilhelm could hear the faint murmur of voices carried on the night air, though the words were indistinguishable at this distance. The consultation lasted only a few minutes before the party resumed their eastward journey, their lanterns gradually disappearing into the darkness as they continued toward whatever destination awaited them. Wilhelm added a final note about the travelers to his logbook. Travelers passed tower vicinity without incident, continuing eastward toward county interior. Behavior consistent with legitimate business travel, no security concerns identified. Estimated party composition: senior leader with 2 or 3 subordinates, well equipped for extended journey. This completed documentation of what had proven to be an interesting but ultimately routine encounter with nighttime travelers. The incident had provided welcome variety to the night's activities without presenting any actual challenges or requiring defensive measures. It had also demonstrated the value of having alert avian observers like Corvus, whose superior senses had detected the approaching group long before Wilhelm's human capabilities would have noticed them. With the travelers continuing on their way and the immediate excitement of their passage resolved, Wilhelm returned to his routine activities. The shadow play resumed with stories inspired by the encounter, tales of mysterious nighttime journeys, of travelers carrying important messages through darkness, of the ancient traditions of hospitality that required tower keepers to observe and protect rather than challenge legitimate wayfarers. The lamp continued its steady burning, now entering that phase of the night when the oil reservoir was beginning to show signs of consumption but still maintained adequate fuel for several more hours of illumination. Wilhelm made a mental note to prepare the backup lamp for eventual use, as proper lighting was essential for maintaining effective vigilance during the final hours before dawn. Klaus's work sounds from the cellar had taken on a different quality, suggesting that he was moving into the final phases of his repair projects. The hammering had become more infrequent, replaced by the sounds of filing, polishing, and final assembly that marked the completion of skilled metalwork. Johann's questions had become less frequent as well, indicating that the apprentice was probably observing finishing techniques that would complete his evening's education in advanced tinker crafts. The night air had begun to carry those subtle hints of approaching dawn that were more felt than observed. A slight shift in temperature, a barely perceptible change in the quality of darkness, and that indefinable sense that the earth was beginning its slow rotation toward the sun. Wilhelm estimated that perhaps 2 hours remained before the first hints of true dawn would appear in the eastern sky, followed by the gradual progression of twilight that would mark the end of another successful night's vigil. Corvus and Minerva continued their patient observation of the landscape, their alertness undiminished by the long hours of watchfulness. Both birds seemed to possess stamina reserves that far exceeded human limitations, maintaining the sort of focused attention that Wilhelm could achieve only through careful management of his energy and deliberate rotation between different types of activities. The countryside had settled into the deep quiet that characterized the final portion of night, when most creatures had either settled into sleep or adapted completely to nocturnal activity patterns. The distant sounds of the village had faded to barely perceptible levels, with only the bakery showing continued signs of purposeful human activity. Even the wolves had ceased their howling, apparently having concluded whatever business had occupied them during the earlier evening hours. Wilhelm found this deep quiet profoundly peaceful, a reminder of why he had chosen the profession of watchman and why he had remained committed to it through 7 years of solitary vigils. There was something deeply satisfying about being awake and alert while the rest of the world slept, about serving as a conscious guardian of unconscious communities, about maintaining the continuity of awareness that ensured that nothing important would be overlooked during the vulnerable hours of darkness. The shadow play continued on the circular walls, now featuring stories about the eternal cycle of night and day, about the ancient covenant between watchers and sleepers, about the subtle but essential role played by those who chose to remain conscious during the hours when consciousness was most difficult to maintain. The shadows danced their silent narratives while the real world continued its slow progression toward dawn, and Wilhelm felt that deep satisfaction that came from fulfilling his proper role in the great ongoing drama of human civilization. As the night moved steadily toward its conclusion, Wilhelm began the gradual process of preparing for the transition to morning duties. The logbook would need to be completed with final entries documenting the night's activities and observations. The lamp would need to be extinguished and cleaned, ready for the following evening's service. Klaus and Johann would need to be properly seen off when dawn made their departure practical and safe. But for now, in these final hours of darkness, Wilhelm continued his ancient duty of professional watchfulness, tending his lamp and observing his domain while shadows danced on stone walls and the patient night slowly, majestically, inevitably surrendered its dominion to the approaching day.